During the day, she helped orphan children learn to read, distributed medicine to families devastated by civil war, and coordinated food deliveries to refugee camps scattered across Somalia's unforgiving landscape. Her colleagues knew her as Margaret Hayes, a dedicated humanitarian worker who had devoted 15 years of her life to serving the world's most vulnerable populations. But when darkness fell over Mogadishu, Margaret shed her aid worker persona and became something else entirely, NATO's most classified reconnaissance specialist, using her humanitarian cover to gather intelligence in places where conventional military operations were impossible. For 15 years, no one suspected that the woman feeding orphans by day was mapping enemy positions by night. Welcome to Silent Legends. Before we journey into the hidden world of humanitarian cover operations, where compassion and espionage intersect in ways that challenge every assumption about aid work, tell me in the comments from which city are you watching this video today. And if you believe legends like Margaret deserve to be remembered, subscribe to witness stories that time forgot, but history never will. The Children's Hope Foundation compound sat on the outskirts of Mogadishu like a small fortress of optimism amid the chaos of Somalia's endless civil war. High walls topped with razor wire protected a cluster of modest buildings that housed classrooms, a medical clinic, and dormitories for the 63 orphan children who called the compound home. Margaret Hayes had managed this facility for 8 years, arriving each morning at 0630 hours in a dusty Land Cruiser marked with the distinctive blue and white logo of an international aid organization. At 44, she possessed the kind of weathered competence that came from years of humanitarian work in conflict zones, steady hands that could start and for or negotiate with warlords, eyes that could assess a child's malnutrition or spot potential security threats, and a calm demeanor that provided stability in a world where violence could erupt without warning. To the children under her care, Margaret was a source of safety and learning. She taught English classes in the morning, helped with medical treatments in the afternoon, and spent her evenings coordinating supply deliveries and managing the complex logistics of maintaining a humanitarian operation in one of the world's most dangerous environments. Her colleagues from other aid organizations respected her practical approach to development work and her ability to maintain operations even during the worst periods of fighting. Margaret seemed to understand Somalia in ways that newer arrivals struggled with. She knew which clan leaders could be trusted, which routes were safe for supply convoys, and how to navigate the complex web of permissions and payments required to operate in territories controlled by different factions. What none of them knew was that Margaret Hayes was not her real name, and humanitarian work was only half of her actual mission. Her true identity was Colonel Margaret Chen, a specialist in reconnaissance and intelligence gathering who had been recruited by NATO's Special Operations Command in 1993, during the early stages of international intervention in Somalia. Her cover as a humanitarian worker was perfect. It provided access to areas where military personnel could never operate, legitimate reasons to maintain contact with local populations, and a credible explanation for the communication equipment and mobility required for intelligence operations. Margaret's recruitment had begun during her genuine service as a Peace Corps volunteer in Kenya, where NATO intelligence had identified her as possessing the unique combination of language skills, cultural adaptability, and psychological resilience required for long-term undercover operations. The intelligence services needed someone who could operate in failed states where conventional diplomatic and military intelligence gathering was impossible. The initial mission had been to monitor the activities of various Somali factions during the United Nations intervention, but as the international presence evolved and reduced, Margaret's intelligence value had actually increased. Her humanitarian cover allowed her to maintain a presence in Somalia long after most foreign military and diplomatic personnel had been withdrawn, providing NATO with crucial intelligence about terrorist activities, weapons trafficking, and the movements of high-value targets. Margaret's specialty was human intelligence, the kind of information that could only be gathered through direct contact with local populations. Her work with orphan children provided perfect cover for this activity, as many of the children came from families connected to various military and political factions. Through careful questioning disguised as routine care, Margaret could learn about troop movements, leadership changes, and planned operations. More importantly, her humanitarian work gave her access to areas of Somalia that were completely off-limits to military personnel. Refugee camps, medical clinics, and schools were often located in territory controlled by hostile factions, but humanitarian workers could sometimes gain access where soldiers and diplomats could not. The compound's communication systems appeared to be standard humanitarian equipment: satellite phones for coordinating with other aid organizations, radio systems for managing supply convoys, and computer terminals for maintaining donor databases. In reality, these systems had been modified to serve dual purposes, allowing Margaret to transmit intelligence reports to NATO while maintaining her cover as an aid coordinator. Margaret's most valuable contributions came from her ability to identify and track high-value targets. Terrorist leaders, weapons dealers, and factional commanders often moved through areas where humanitarian organizations operated, and Margaret's trained eye could recognize individuals whose movements were of interest to NATO intelligence. The psychological challenge of Margaret's double life was extraordinary. Every day, she provided genuine help to children who had lost everything to war, while simultaneously gathering information that could be used in military operations that might affect their communities. She built real relationships with local staff and community leaders, all while concealing her true purpose and maintaining loyalties to an organization they would consider their enemy. But Margaret's most difficult challenge was not the deception required by her cover, it was the genuine attachment she had developed to the children and communities she served. Over 8 years, her humanitarian work had become more than just a cover story. She cared deeply about the orphans under her protection, the communities that depended on the Foundation's services, and the local staff who had become her friends and colleagues. The mission that would ultimately expose Margaret's true identity began with intelligence about a meeting between several high-value targets in a location that only someone with humanitarian access could reach. The intelligence came through Margaret's encrypted communication system on a Tuesday evening in March 2008, while she was reviewing supply requests for the following month's food distribution. NATO had received credible information that 3 high-value targets, a senior al-Shabaab commander, a weapons trafficker with ties to international terrorist networks, and a factional leader suspected of coordinating attacks against international personnel, would be meeting in a refugee camp located 60 kilometers north of Mogadishu. The meeting was scheduled to coincide with a medical clinic that Margaret's organization was planning to conduct at the camp, providing her with perfect cover for gathering intelligence about the participants, their security arrangements, and their plans. But the operation would require her to take extraordinary risks that went far beyond her normal intelligence-gathering activities. Margaret studied the mission parameters while maintaining her cover duties. The refugee camp was located in territory controlled by a faction that was nominally allied with the transitional government but was suspected of providing support to terrorist organizations. Access would require negotiating with local commanders who were known to be hostile to international personnel, and the medical clinic would bring Margaret and her team within close proximity to individuals who would not hesitate to kill them if their true purpose was discovered. The intelligence value of the operation was enormous. The 3 targets had never been located in the same place at the same time, and the opportunity to gather information about their coordination and future plans was too important to pass up. But conducting surveillance in a refugee camp full of innocent civilians created risks that conventional military operations could never accept. Margaret's mission was complicated by the fact that the medical clinic was a genuine humanitarian operation that would provide crucial healthcare to hundreds of refugees who had no other access to medical treatment. Canceling the clinic to avoid operational risks would deny medical care to people who desperately needed it, while proceeding with the mission would put both her humanitarian team and the refugee population at risk. The decision to proceed came when Margaret learned that one of the children from her compound, a 10-year-old boy named Hassan whose family had been killed in factional fighting, had relatives in the refugee camp who had been requesting medical assistance for weeks. The boy had been asking Margaret to help his remaining family members, and the medical clinic represented their only hope for receiving treatment for conditions that could be life-threatening if left untreated. Margaret realized that her personal attachment to Hassan and his family was creating emotional complications that professional intelligence operatives were trained to avoid, but she also understood that this emotional investment was what made her humanitarian cover so effective. Her genuine care for the children and communities she served was what allowed her to maintain credibility and access that no traditional intelligence operative could achieve. The preparation for the mission required Margaret to coordinate with her humanitarian team while secretly planning intelligence-gathering activities that she could not reveal to anyone. Her medical colleagues were focused on organizing supplies, scheduling treatments, and arranging transportation, while Margaret was simultaneously planning surveillance operations, escape routes, and communication protocols. Dr. Sarah Williams, a British physician who had been working with Margaret's organization for 6 months, noticed that Margaret seemed unusually tense during the planning meetings. "You seem more worried about this clinic than usual," she observed during a supply inventory session. Margaret had to carefully balance her response to avoid arousing suspicion while acknowledging the legitimate security concerns that any humanitarian worker would have about operating in such a dangerous area. "The security situation has been deteriorating," she said truthfully. "We'll need to be very careful about our procedures and timing." The medical team consisted of 4 international staff members and 8 local employees, none of whom had any knowledge of Margaret's intelligence mission. Their safety depended on maintaining the appearance of a routine humanitarian operation while Margaret conducted surveillance activities that could compromise everyone if discovered. The convoy to the refugee camp departed at 0600 hours on the scheduled day, with Margaret riding in the lead vehicle and maintaining radio contact with her team while simultaneously monitoring NATO intelligence frequencies through equipment concealed in her medical supplies. The 60-kilometer journey took them through 3 different territorial boundaries, requiring negotiations with checkpoint guards who were suspicious of international personnel but generally cooperative with recognized humanitarian organizations. Margaret's training allowed her to assess security threats while appearing to focus on humanitarian logistics. She noted the positions of armed guards, the types of weapons visible at checkpoints, and the general alertness levels of the various factions they encountered. This information would be valuable for future NATO operations in the area, but it also helped her evaluate the risks her team was facing. The refugee camp was larger than Margaret had expected, with over 3,000 displaced persons living in temporary shelters spread across several square kilometers. The scale of human suffering was overwhelming even for someone who had worked in humanitarian crises for 15 years, but Margaret had to maintain focus on her intelligence mission while providing genuine medical care to people who desperately needed it. Setting up the medical clinic required 2 hours of careful coordination with camp leaders and United Nations personnel who were already working in the area. Margaret used this time to conduct initial surveillance of the camp, identifying potential locations where the target meeting might occur and noting the security arrangements that were already in place. The 3 high-value targets arrived at the camp within minutes of each other, exactly as NATO intelligence had predicted. Margaret recognized them from photographs and briefing materials, but she had to continue her medical coordination duties while secretly documenting their presence and activities. The surveillance became more complex when Margaret realized that the targets were not just meeting for planning purposes, they were conducting a weapons transfer that involved substantial quantities of military equipment being moved through the refugee camp. The operation was far more significant than NATO had anticipated, and the intelligence value of documenting it was enormous. But Margaret also realized that the weapons transfer was putting the entire refugee population at risk, and that her continued surveillance was placing her humanitarian team in a situation that could turn deadly if the operation was discovered. The weapons transfer was conducted with sophisticated operational security that Margaret recognized as being far beyond the capabilities of typical Somali factional groups. The coordination, equipment, and procedures suggested international terrorist involvement at a level that NATO intelligence had not previously detected in Somalia. Margaret documented the operation using equipment concealed in her medical supplies, but she also realized that the intelligence she was gathering revealed a threat that extended far beyond Somalia's internal conflicts. The weapons being transferred included shoulder-fired missiles capable of threatening civilian aircraft, explosives suitable for terrorist attacks in urban environments, and communication equipment that could coordinate operations across multiple countries. The revelation that her refugee camp medical clinic had inadvertently provided cover for documenting a major international terrorist operation created an immediate dilemma. The intelligence was crucial for preventing future attacks, but gathering it required Margaret to compromise the safety of her humanitarian team and the refugee population. Margaret's situation became critical when one of the target individuals noticed her paying unusual attention to the weapons transfer area. Hassan al-Duri, the al-Shabaab commander, was known for his paranoia and his willingness to use violence against anyone he perceived as a threat. His interest in Margaret's activities could quickly escalate into a confrontation that would expose her intelligence mission and endanger everyone in the medical clinic. The confrontation came when Al-Duri approached Margaret directly while she was treating patients in the clinic's main treatment area. "You are asking many questions about things that do not concern medical treatment," he said in Arabic, his tone suggesting suspicion rather than casual interest. Margaret's cover depended on responding in a way that would satisfy Al-Duri's concerns while maintaining her humanitarian credentials. "I'm concerned about the security of my medical team," she replied in fluent Arabic, using the language skills that were part of her genuine humanitarian qualifications. "We need to understand the environment we're working in to ensure we can provide safe medical care." Al-Duri studied her for a long moment before responding. "You speak Arabic very well for a humanitarian worker. Where did you learn?" The question was more dangerous than it appeared. Margaret's Arabic was too fluent and too sophisticated for someone whose language training had come only from humanitarian work. Her accent and vocabulary revealed military language training that could expose her intelligence background if Al-Duri was knowledgeable enough to recognize it. "I studied in Jordan before beginning my humanitarian work," Margaret answered, using a cover story that was partially true but concealed the military context of her language training. Before Al-Duri could pursue the conversation further, Dr. Williams interrupted with a legitimate medical emergency that required Margaret's immediate attention. A child in the camp had been severely injured in an accident, and Margaret's expertise was needed to stabilize the patient before evacuation to a better-equipped medical facility. The medical emergency provided Margaret with a legitimate reason to end her conversation with Al-Duri, but it also created new complications for her intelligence mission. Treating the injured child required her full attention and prevented her from documenting the final stages of the weapons transfer. More importantly, the child's injuries were severe enough to require immediate evacuation, which would force Margaret to choose between her humanitarian responsibilities and her intelligence mission. Margaret's decision to prioritize the child's medical needs over her intelligence gathering represented a fundamental shift in her approach to the dual mission she had been conducting for 8 years. For the first time, her humanitarian work took precedence over her intelligence objectives, and she found herself calling for medical evacuation while knowing that it would prevent her from completing her reconnaissance mission. The evacuation helicopter arrived within 40 minutes, providing urgent medical transport for the injured child but also creating a situation that made it impossible for Margaret to maintain covert surveillance of the terrorist meeting. The helicopter's presence drew attention throughout the camp and prompted the high-value targets to accelerate their departure schedule. As Margaret accompanied the injured child on the evacuation flight, she watched the weapons transfer conclude below without being able to document its final stages. She had gathered crucial intelligence about the operation's scope and international connections, but she had also chosen to prioritize humanitarian concerns over military objectives in a way that would have significant consequences for her intelligence mission. The flight to Mogadishu's main hospital took 30 minutes, during which Margaret provided medical care for the injured child while simultaneously composing the intelligence report that would be transmitted to NATO as soon as secure communications became available. The report documented the presence of the 3 high-value targets, the scale of the weapons transfer, and the evidence of international terrorist coordination, but it also acknowledged that the mission had been incomplete due to the medical emergency. Margaret's handler, operating under diplomatic cover at the United Nations mission in Mogadishu, met her at the hospital to receive the intelligence report and debrief the operation. The conversation took place in a secure conference room while Margaret maintained her cover as a humanitarian worker coordinating the child's medical treatment. "The intelligence you gathered is extraordinarily valuable," the handler confirmed after reviewing Margaret's report. "This is the first time we've documented direct coordination between these 3 targets, and the evidence of international weapons trafficking will support multiple ongoing operations." But Margaret could see the concern in her handler's expression. "Al-Duri's interest in your activities was noted by our surveillance team. He's already making inquiries about your background and the nature of your organization's work in Somalia." The revelation that NATO had maintained independent surveillance of the refugee camp operation meant that Margaret's intelligence mission had been part of a larger operation involving multiple assets and approaches. But it also meant that Al-Duri's suspicions about her activities were being taken seriously by someone with the resources and motivation to investigate her cover story. How compromised is my position? Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Al-Duri has resources for investigating international personnel, and your Arabic language skills have already raised questions. We estimate you have perhaps 72 hours before your cover becomes untenable. Margaret looked through the hospital window at the children's ward where Hassan was being treated for his minor injuries sustained during the evacuation. After 8 years of maintaining her cover while building genuine relationships and conducting meaningful humanitarian work, her intelligence mission was ending because she had chosen to prioritize medical care over intelligence gathering. What are my extraction options? She asked, though part of her already knew that leaving Somalia would mean abandoning the children, staff, and communities that had become the most important part of her life. The decision to extract Margaret from Somalia within 72 hours created a crisis that extended far beyond the immediate threats to her personal safety. Her departure would effectively end the Children's Hope Foundation's operations in Somalia, leaving 63 orphan children without care and closing the only medical clinic serving several rural communities that depended on her organization for healthcare. Margaret's NATO handler explained the extraction plan during their secure meeting at the hospital. A diplomatic flight would be arranged through the United Nations mission, providing her with safe passage out of Somalia under the cover of routine staff rotation. Her replacement would be a legitimate humanitarian worker with no intelligence connections, ensuring that the Foundation's work could continue without the complications created by her dual mission. But Margaret realized that extracting her from Somalia would destroy 8 years of intelligence infrastructure that had provided NATO with unprecedented access to information about terrorist activities in the Horn of Africa. Her network of local contacts, her understanding of factional dynamics, and her ability to operate in areas where conventional intelligence gathering was impossible represented capabilities that could not be easily replaced. More importantly, Margaret had developed genuine relationships and responsibilities that made the prospect of immediate departure emotionally devastating. Hassan, the 10-year-old boy whose medical emergency had interrupted her surveillance mission, had no living relatives outside the Foundation's care. Dr. Williams and the other international staff depended on Margaret's expertise and local knowledge to maintain their humanitarian operations. The local employees who worked for the Foundation trusted Margaret and had built their livelihoods around the assumption that her organization would continue providing stable employment. Margaret's request to delay her extraction by 2 weeks to ensure an orderly transition of her humanitarian responsibilities was denied by NATO security protocols. Al-Duri's investigation is accelerating, her handler explained. Signals intelligence indicates that he's already contacted sources who can verify or disprove your cover story. If you're still in Somalia when that verification fails, your safety cannot be guaranteed. The revelation that Signals intelligence was monitoring Al-Duri's communications meant that NATO had capabilities in Somalia that extended far beyond Margaret's individual mission. But it also meant that her exposure could compromise other operations and put additional personnel at risk. Margaret spent her final night in Somalia completing a transition plan that would minimize the disruption to the Foundation's humanitarian work while protecting the local staff who might face retaliation if Al-Duri's suspicions about her activities proved correct. The plan involved transferring the most vulnerable children to partner organizations in Kenya, providing severance payments for local employees, and ensuring that medical supplies would continue reaching the communities that depended on the Foundation's services. But Margaret also used her final night to complete intelligence activities that would provide NATO with information crucial for future operations in Somalia. Her 8 years of building relationships and gathering information had given her insights into Somali factional dynamics that were available from no other source, and she was determined to ensure that this knowledge would be preserved for future use. Working through the night, Margaret compiled a comprehensive intelligence assessment that documented the leadership structures, territorial boundaries, supply routes, and operational patterns of every significant faction operating in southern Somalia. The assessment included profiles of over 200 individuals whose activities were relevant to NATO's counterterrorism objectives, along with recommendations for future intelligence gathering approaches that could be implemented by conventional diplomatic and military personnel. The assessment also included Margaret's analysis of the weapons transfer she had observed at the refugee camp, placing it in the context of larger patterns of international terrorist activity that she had been tracking for years. Her conclusion was that Somalia was serving as a transit point for weapons and personnel moving between terrorist organizations in multiple countries, and that the cooperation between al-Shabaab and international terrorist networks was far more extensive than NATO had previously understood. Margaret's extraction began at 0400 hours with a convoy to Mogadishu's international airport, where a United Nations flight was scheduled to depart for Nairobi at 0630. The convoy route was deliberately indirect to avoid areas where al-Duri's forces might attempt to intercept her departure, but it also took her past the Foundation's compound where she could see the lights still burning in the children's dormitories. At the airport, Margaret's cover story was that she was rotating back to her organization's headquarters for routine consultation and training, with plans to return to Somalia within 2 months. The deception was necessary to protect the local staff and partner organizations that would face scrutiny after her departure, but it also meant that she could not provide closure for the relationships that had become the most meaningful part of her life. Dr. Williams accompanied Margaret to the airport, still believing that the departure was temporary and routine. "The children will miss you," she said as they waited for the flight to board. "Especially Hassan. He's been asking when you'll be back." Margaret's response had to maintain her cover while acknowledging the reality that she would probably never see Hassan or the other children again. "Tell him that I'll always remember how brave he was during the medical emergency at the refugee camp," she said, knowing that the words were inadequate for the situation but unable to provide the explanation that would make sense of her sudden departure. The flight to Nairobi took 2 hours, during which Margaret watched the Somali coastline disappear beneath the aircraft while reflecting on 8 years of dual identity that had ended with her humanitarian responsibilities taking precedence over her intelligence mission. She had saved a child's life but had also lost her ability to continue protecting the children and communities that had become her primary focus. In Nairobi, Margaret was debriefed by NATO intelligence specialists who wanted to extract every detail of her 8 years of operations before her knowledge became dated. The debriefing process took 3 days and covered everything from specific intelligence about terrorist activities to broader assessments of political and social dynamics throughout Somalia. Margaret's final intelligence report was classified at the highest levels and distributed to policymakers throughout NATO who were responsible for counterterrorism operations in the Horn of Africa. The report's recommendations influenced diplomatic initiatives, military planning, and humanitarian policies that affected millions of people throughout the region. But Margaret's personal transition from covert operative to acknowledged intelligence specialist was complicated by the genuine humanitarian expertise she had developed during her 8 years of cover work. Her knowledge of development practices, medical protocols, and community organizing had become as sophisticated as her intelligence skills, and NATO recognized that this combination made her uniquely valuable for future operations. Margaret's post-extraction career involved developing new approaches to intelligence gathering in failed states and conflict zones, using her unique experience to train other operatives in maintaining humanitarian cover while conducting reconnaissance missions. Her expertise in combining genuine development work with intelligence gathering became the foundation for a new category of operations that balanced humanitarian goals with security objectives. NATO assigned Margaret to design training programs for operatives who would work under humanitarian cover in various conflict zones around the world. Her curriculum emphasized the importance of developing genuine expertise in development work, building authentic relationships with local communities, and maintaining ethical standards that would preserve the credibility of humanitarian organizations. But Margaret's most significant contribution was her advocacy for operational approaches that prioritized humanitarian objectives even when they conflicted with intelligence gathering requirements. Her decision to prioritize medical evacuation over surveillance during the refugee camp operation became a case study in balancing competing objectives under extreme circumstances. Margaret's recommendations led to policy changes that provided greater protection for humanitarian organizations operating in conflict zones, ensuring that intelligence activities would not compromise the safety or effectiveness of legitimate aid work. Her work contributed to new international agreements that clarified the boundaries between humanitarian and military activities in complex emergencies. The Children's Hope Foundation continued operating in Somalia for 2 years after Margaret's departure, eventually closing when security conditions made international humanitarian work impossible throughout much of the country. Many of the children Margaret had cared for were successfully resettled with partner organizations in Kenya and other neighboring countries, though Hassan and several other children were lost during the factional fighting that intensified after international organizations withdrew from the region. Margaret maintained contact with Dr. Williams and other former colleagues through unofficial channels, learning about the eventual fate of the Foundation and the communities it had served. The knowledge that her intelligence work had contributed to military operations that may have affected the same communities she had worked to protect created psychological challenges that required years of professional counseling to resolve. Al-Duri was killed in a drone strike 6 months after Margaret's extraction, based partly on intelligence she had gathered about his operational patterns and security arrangements. While his death disrupted several planned terrorist attacks, it also resulted in retaliation against aid workers throughout Somalia, demonstrating the complex consequences of intelligence operations conducted under humanitarian cover. Margaret's memoir, published in 2015 with heavy redaction to protect ongoing operations and the safety of former contacts, became an influential account of the challenges faced by intelligence operatives working under humanitarian cover. The book provided insights into the psychological demands of maintaining dual identities while building genuine relationships with communities that would consider the operatives' true employers to be their enemies.
The reforms that resulted from Margaret's recommendations led to improved protection for humanitarian workers worldwide, with intelligence agencies developing new protocols that minimize the risks to legitimate aid organizations while maintaining necessary intelligence gathering capabilities in conflict zones. In 2018, Margaret established a foundation that provides education and healthcare services to refugee communities in Kenya, many of whom were originally from Somalia. The foundation operates with complete transparency about its funding sources and objectives, representing Margaret's commitment to conducting humanitarian work without the complications created by intelligence missions. Margaret's work with refugee communities allowed her to reconnect with some of the children she had cared for during her years in Somalia, including Hassan, who had survived the conflict and eventually made his way to Kenya. Their reunion provided closure for Margaret's Somalia mission and confirmed that her decision to prioritize humanitarian concerns over intelligence objectives had saved lives that extended far beyond the immediate medical emergency that had forced her extraction. Today, the protocols developed based on Margaret's recommendations are standard practice for intelligence agencies operating in conflict zones worldwide. Her work created new frameworks for balancing intelligence gathering with humanitarian protection, ensuring that security objectives do not compromise the safety and effectiveness of aid organizations. Margaret's story demonstrates that some of the most important intelligence work is conducted by individuals who genuinely care about the communities they serve, and that the best cover for intelligence operations is often authentic expertise and commitment to humanitarian goals. Her 15 years of dual identity proved that effective reconnaissance sometimes requires operatives who can function as both intelligence professionals and genuine humanitarian workers. The refugee camps of East Africa continue to shelter millions of people displaced by conflict, drought, and political instability. International humanitarian organizations work tirelessly to provide healthcare, education, and basic services to populations that have lost everything to circumstances beyond their control. But Margaret's story serves as a reminder that in the world's most dangerous places, the line between humanitarian work and security operations is often blurred in ways that challenge every assumption about aid work. Margaret's 15-year mission in Somalia represents one of the longest and most successful humanitarian cover operations in intelligence history. Her ability to maintain genuine expertise in development work while conducting crucial reconnaissance demonstrated that the two roles, rather than being contradictory, could be mutually reinforcing when performed by individuals with the right combination of skills and dedication. The intelligence network that Margaret exposed prevented numerous terrorist attacks and provided NATO with unprecedented insights into the coordination between international terrorist organizations. But perhaps more importantly, her humanitarian work genuinely improved the lives of thousands of children and families who had no other source of support during Somalia's darkest years. Margaret's story illustrates the complex relationship between security and humanitarian work in an era when failed states provide safe havens for terrorist organizations while simultaneously creating massive humanitarian crises. Her career required her to navigate the tension between the intelligence community's need for information and the humanitarian community's commitment to neutrality and service. The personal cost of Margaret's mission was enormous. 15 years of false identity, the inability to form lasting personal relationships outside her operational context, and the ultimate sacrifice of her humanitarian career when her intelligence work was exposed. Her dedication to both missions, despite these costs, exemplifies the kind of service that protects society from threats while genuinely helping the world's most vulnerable populations. The reforms that resulted from Margaret's work have made humanitarian operations safer by creating clearer boundaries between aid work and intelligence gathering, while also ensuring that security operations can continue in areas where conventional military and diplomatic presence is impossible. Today, as humanitarian crises multiply around the world and terrorist organizations continue to exploit failed states and refugee populations, Margaret's approach provides a model for how intelligence agencies and humanitarian organizations can work together to maximize benefits while minimizing risks to all involved. Margaret's 15 years in Somalia remind us that some of history's most important intelligence work is conducted by individuals whose greatest achievements must remain hidden from those they protect. Her dual identity as humanitarian worker and intelligence operative allowed her to serve both security and humanitarian objectives in ways that neither mission could have achieved independently. The children who learned to read in Margaret's classrooms, the families who received medical care at her clinics, and the communities that depended on her organization services were all genuinely helped by her humanitarian work. At the same time, the intelligence she gathered prevented terrorist attacks that could have killed thousands of innocent people in multiple countries. Margaret's career proved that protecting humanitarian work sometimes requires acknowledging the security threats that make such work necessary, while ensuring that intelligence operations do not compromise the neutrality and effectiveness that allow humanitarian organizations to serve populations in need. The refugee camps where Margaret worked continue to shelter people displaced by the same conflicts she helped intelligence agencies understand and address. Her legacy demonstrates that serving both security and humanitarian objectives simultaneously is possible when conducted by individuals with the expertise and commitment to excel in both roles. In an age when humanitarian needs and security threats are often intertwined in complex ways, Margaret's story provides a framework for balancing service to vulnerable populations with protection against those who would exploit humanitarian crises for destructive purposes. Her career showed that these seemingly contradictory goals can be achieved by individuals willing to dedicate their lives to both missions. The orphaned children Margaret cared for in Somalia grew up to become teachers, doctors, and community leaders who continue her work of building better futures for vulnerable populations. The intelligence she gathered continues to inform security operations that protect innocent people from terrorist attacks. Both legacies represent the same fundamental commitment to protecting and serving others. Have you ever wondered about the hidden guardians who protect humanitarian work from those who would exploit it? Have you known someone whose greatest service was conducted while serving vulnerable populations? Share their story in the comments below. Thank you for watching Silent Legends. If this story moved you, subscribe and help us honor those who were never meant to be forgotten but whose courage deserves to be remembered.